Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share some All Seasons collection cards with you. Now, this All Seasons collection is a collection that's exclusive to the Spellbinders website. There are 4 different press plate sets and dies, one for each season. So there's All Seasons Spring, All Seasons Summer, All Seasons Autumn, and All Seasons Winter. Each one of those sets creates multiple sentiments at once. And those sentiments are perfect for that season. And there's also some really unique ones in there that I haven't seen before. And then I'm also using the All Seasons stamp set. This has a combination of some of the different sentiments from the press plate and die sets, but in a clear stamp form. And if they're not exactly the same size, they're very similar in size. So it's nice to be able to have that alternative as well if there is a sentiment you just want to stamp somewhere. So the first one I'm going to use is the All Seasons Spring. So I'm going to do my sentiments first for this. I'm putting it on the base of my Better Press system. I'm going to be using some watercolor paper because the card that I want to create, I want to do some watercoloring, and I want my cardstock for my sentiment to coordinate with the cardstock I'm using for my image. Now I'm just using some Versamark ink here to do my sentiments. I want to emboss them with some gold embossing powder. I also put some embossing powder tulle on my paper so that that embossing powder hopefully sticks to only where the sentiments get pressed. If you get any powder anywhere else, you can use a small brush to brush it off, and you definitely want to do that before melting your powder. So once I have my paper onto my clear plate, I put the clear plate on the base, run it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine to press that sentiment in place. And you can see that I did get some embossing powder where I didn't want it in that one area. So before heating that powder, I'm going to use a small brush and remove as much as possible and do it as cleanly as possible. I don't want to ruin that sentiment either. I'm using my embossing tool to melt that powder. Now, like I said before, I'm using some watercolor paper here because the image that I'm using is watercolor paper. If you are using watercolor paper that is more white, you could just use white cardstock. It doesn't necessarily have to be watercolor cardstock, but because it isn't off-white, I wanted to make sure that they were going to match, and it works perfectly for pressing as well. I'm also going to be doing pressing and embossing for my image, which is why I'm doing my sentiments the exact same way, so it coordinates beautifully. So for my images, I'm using this Spring Magnolias press plate and die set. I have all 4 of the Magnolia images on my base. I'm going to tape that watercolor paper in place, and I just keep reusing that same tape that I'm using over and over again. I just keep using it until it stops sticking. There's no reason to use it once and then toss it. I'm repeating the exact same steps that I used for my sentiments. I'm using some embossing powder tulle on my cardstock once again to make sure that that powder sticks mainly to my image and not anywhere else on the cardstock. I used Versamark pad to ink my image, and then I'm going to use that same gold embossing powder that I used for my sentiments. Now, I like to use super fine embossing powder when I'm doing embossed press plate designs, simply because those images get pressed into that cardstock, and I find that super fine powder, embossing powder, sticks a little bit better, and you get a little bit more powder on there than just regular embossing powder. So it's just a personal preference. If I were just to stamp the image, for me, it wouldn't really matter which one I use. I know some people have a preference for that, but for doing the pressing, I especially like to use the superfine powder when possible. With both of my images embossed, I can die cut my sentiments. I'm going to hold off die cutting my Magnolias because I want to wait until they're after they are watercolored. It's going to be much easier to watercolor them while in a full sheet, or the quarter sheet as this is, rather than die cutting them and then watercoloring. But if you prefer that, there's no reason you can't. This is just a personal preference of mine. When I line up my sentiment die with the sentiments on my cardstock, I like to tape it in place with that same Best Ever Craft tape just to make sure that that die isn't going to shift and move. And once again, I keep reusing that tape over and over again until it stops sticking. Now for watercoloring my images, I'm going to use some Cloud9 interference pads. I'm using Cherry Bomb for the Magnolias, and then I'm going to use Summer Garden for the leaves. Now I use Cloud9 interference ink pads very often on my channel. I have a full playlist dedicated right to them. These are inks that have interference properties to them. They look one color on white cardstock, a completely different color on black cardstock. And that's thanks to the interference or the mica or whatever it is that makes that magic happen. But you can do more than just use white and dark cardstock with them. You can absolutely watercolor with them. I'm just using my ink pad, smushing it on my glass surface here and using that as a palette. If you have the re-inker for it, you can just mix up your re-inker or shake your bottle. You want to make sure that it's all shaken together, and then put a drop or two on your surface or on a non-porous surface or on a paint palette, and you can use that for watercoloring. The pads that I'm using, I don't have a re-inker for them, so this works just as well. Now, even though I'm working on light cardstock, where I'm watercoloring, where that color is darkest and deepest, you're going to get a little tiny bit of that interference color showing. So for this cherry bomb, the color on white is like a pinky red, and then the color on black is more of like a purpley color. So when I'm done my watercoloring, I will be able to see just a tiny little bit of that purple mica shimmer where my color is heaviest. Now, it doesn't show up as well on camera as it does in real life, but it's a really pretty effect, and it's a fun way just to add just a little bit of extra interest to your watercolored images. You could get a similar effect if you were to mix your watercolor, whatever you're using for watercolor, with a little bit of Perfect Pearls, which is a mica powder that has a binding agent in it. So if you don't have these interference pads, you can play around and get a somewhat similar look. It's going to be a little bit different, but it is another way to get a little bit of that mica shimmer in there. I just like it because it adds a little bit of extra interest, but it doesn't take away from the design. I love doing watercolor, and I love doing it with different mediums. I will often use distress re-inkers. I will use dye-based pens to do my watercoloring as well, but this is just a different way to do it, and it's also another use for your Cloud9 interference pads if you have them. It's just a fun way to use them. So now I've done all of my flowers. I'm going to do my greenery, and I'm doing that one with the summer garden. This one here looks green on white or light cardstock, and the interference color for this one is a blue. So where my color or where my green is darkest for the leaves, once it's dry, you're going to see just a tiny little bit of blue shimmer. Not so much that it's going to take away from anything, but it just adds a little bit of different texture to it. So once I have all of my images there watercolored, I'll let that dry for a few moments, and once it's completely dried, I will line up my dies, tape them in place, and then die cut them. And for all of the dies, anytime I'm die cutting something that is already done, I always like to tape my dies and make sure that those don't shift on me. I did that die cutting off screen, and before I start assembling my card, I do want to create a textured background. So I'm using a Flourish embossing folder, and I'm embossing some Barely Peach cardstock to go behind my flowers. This is going to coordinate really pretty with it, and it just gives a little bit more texture to that background rather than having it very flat. So once that was embossed, I cut that down to 3 3/4 inches by 5 inches, and then I cut a piece of white hammermill cardstock down to 5 1/4 by 4 inches. This is going to be a mat behind that embossed piece. And in order to make it coordinate beautifully with my image, I just took that that Summer Garden interference ink pad and just ran that along the edges of my background. It doesn't need to be over the whole thing, just around the edges that you're going to see. In order to make my sentiment coordinate, I used the remaining ink that's on my surface, and I did a quick watercolor over my sentiment, and because that is already watercolor paper, it's going to take it beautifully, and I'll set that aside to dry till I'm ready for it. Now that my ink on my mat here is dry, I can glue that to my card base. Then I'm going to glue down my emboss piece. Now I will often put a large acrylic block over my pieces while they're drying. Just frees up my hands and keeps everything nice and flat while it's drying, making sure that that glue has some good contact. I'm gluing everything with some Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. I love it in a fine tip bottle because I can use it for large backgrounds, but I can also use it for really tiny die cuts if I want. And it's nice to have that same glue in the same bottle. Because I have that clear acrylic block over top of my card base, I can start figuring out exactly how I want my flowers to lay on my card. Now, in my mind, it was going to be in the top left corner. But when I started laying it out, I really didn't like how it was looking. It just didn't work for me. So then I could play around with having it in the center of the card. And just because those pieces are all full doesn't mean I can't cut them smaller. And just because I watercolored 4 pieces doesn't mean I have to use them all. I do end up using them all, but if it doesn't work, you can leave some of them off if you want. Just use a few of them. Once you have your design figured out, they can start gluing it onto the card base. And I like to make sure that I'm generous with the glue because I am gluing this onto an embossed background. I want to make sure that glue has really good contact with those raised areas. Now I'm not pressing anything in place because I know that I'm going to be tucking things underneath. So there's no point until everything is where it needs to be. Then I can tuck it exactly where I want it to go. And then I will put my acrylic block on there and let that dry for a few moments. The sentiment can go just on top. You could put it on top of the flowers. I end up putting it towards the base of the stem. I tend to like to have that sentiment over the stem rather than having a stem just hanging there. And for a finishing touch, I'm just using a touch of stickles in the center of those flowers and then letting that dry. It's just going to give it a little bit of extra sparkle in the center there. And remember that All Season Spring press plate created a bunch of sentiments. I only use one of them. So I have a bunch of sentiments set to the side that I can use on future projects. My next plate that I'm going to be using is the All Seasons Summer press plate. So I'm going to do this with just some plain black ink here. I'm going to use this with the Dancin' in the Rain die set. I've used this a couple times before, and this one is one of the die sets that creates a really simple interactive card that has the legs dancing. I'm not going to do that with this video because I've already done that before. I'm just going to glue it down straight, but I absolutely love this Make a Splash sentiment in this set, and I thought that was absolutely perfect to go with that particular die set. Once again, I have a bunch of sentiments created here, but I'm not going to use them all, so I can set the rest of them aside and use them on future projects. For the background of my card, I have some Hammermill cardstock here on top of an Altenew sticky mat. I was going to do some ink blending, but my brush doesn't really want to take that ink, so I ended up just swiping the ink across the card instead, and I actually like the look of it better. This ink is Cloud9 Painted Eggshell Matte Blending Ink. It's a dye-based ink that has a little bit of a pigment property to it, so it's kind of similar to oxides. It's also reactive to water. I absolutely love the color of this. So once I had swiped around the edge or along the back of that paper, I just used my distress sprayer, sprayed some water into my hand and flicked it on that back. I wanted to have the look of water splashing or raindrops. I thought that would suit the sentiment really, really well. I did all the die cutting for my figure off screen, and I can easily assemble it. This particular umbrella, there's little lines showing you the divide between each one of the colors, so it's really easy to know where every one of them goes. And then there's a tiny little tip for the umbrella. I find it much easier to try to use it with my reverse tweezers, then put the glue on it, and then put it onto that die cut. And you can see how it was just fighting with me while I was creating it. So much easier to use that reverse tweezers than trying to hold that tiny little piece while putting glue on it. So for my legs, I'm just going to glue the jacket onto the legs. If you want to see how this would be created to create the interactive, the dancing part, I've linked this video that I'm using it with that dancing legs at the end of this video. And I also, in that particular video, did another interactive card where I made the umbrella spin. So there's a couple different ways that you can use it and just have some fun with it. For those cards that I linked in the video, I didn't use the little duck that comes with this die set in that video, so I'm using it with this one. So I just did a yellow duck, used the black for the legs and the beak, and then have some dahlia colored cardstock for the boots. The color cardstock that I used for the actual duck is called Sunkissed, and for my umbrella I used Raindrop and Cosmic Sky. I'm going to do a dahlia matte around my ink blended background or ink covered background to coordinate beautifully with the little rain boots on the figure. So now that those pieces are ready, I can start assembling my card. So I'm using the Barely Art glue, gluing down my dahlia matte, and then I'm going to be gluing down my ink blended piece. Now my dahlia piece is cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. The inked piece is cut down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And once I have those glued down, I'll put my acrylic block on there just to hold them down nice and flat. Then I can start adding the little die cut pieces. The first one I'm doing is the puddle, and I die cut that one out of mirror silver cardstock from the Silver Treasured cardstock pack. This is a pack that has 5 different finishes of silver cardstock, and I love the fact that there are the different finishes there so that you can pick and choose exactly which color or which finish is going to work best with the project that you're creating. Once that puddle was glued down, I can glue down the little figure and then the duck and then finally the umbrella. Now, because this sentiment says make a splash, I thought it would be fun to have some fun with glossy accents and the elements of this card. So I'm going to put the glossy accents all along the puddle at the bottom, but I also want to have some splash drops. So I'm going to use the glossy accents for that. And I'm also going to put a little bit of it dripping down from the umbrella. So glossy accents, it's a fun way to just create an area that is glossy. Now, because my inked background is water reactive, it's likely going to change the color of that ink a little bit, but I don't mind that. I want to make sure that this is seen. You're going to be able to see it because of the glossy finish anyways, but I also like the fact that it just alters the color of that background just slightly, making those little splash marks from the puddle a little bit more visible. So I have a fine tip put on my glossy accents bottle. It was just from a bottle that I had that I can't even remember what the deal was with it, but I put it on my glossy accents because I wanted something that had a finer tip to it, and it works perfectly. If you don't have as fine a tip on your glossy accents bottle, what you can do is you can put your glossy accents down and then say use a die pick or a toothpick or something really fine and sharp and manipulate the glossy accents and have it looking exactly how you want it to look. So with that card done, I'm just setting it aside for that glossy accents to dry while I work on my third one. So for the third one, I'm working with the autumn or the All Seasons Autumn press plate and die set, and I wanted to have more of a Halloween feel to it. I'm going to use it along with the Olive Martinis die set as well as the Booze Cocktail die set, and I'm going to create a shaker card with that die set. For my sentiment, I wanted it to be in Halloween colors, so I used a carved pumpkin distress pad to do my inking for that plate before pressing it. Now, the great thing about press plates is you can use pretty much any ink pad with them. I haven't found an ink pad yet that doesn't work. I do find that smaller ink pads work on more detailed pieces than larger ones, especially when using the Better Press registration plates. But I haven't found an ink that these plates can't handle. So that is fantastic. You can use whichever inks you're wanting to do whatever creation you're wanting. For the front of my shaker card, I want to cut a little piece of acetate to cover the window. And I did that by taking the piece that gets cut out from the center when you die cut it and using that as a guide to cut out that acetate. Now for my top wine glass, I'm using the Cloud9 Interference ink in Regal Gray and just doing a little bit of ink blending at the bottom of that glass. It's going to give a little bit of a purple shimmer. This ink pad shows up gray on white cardstock and purple on black cardstock. So it's just a fun way to get a little bit of a different look to it. And you could even have fun with these ink pads with the drink inside. I did some light ink blending on a piece of black cardstock just to show you that if you wanted to create kind of a drink that has a little bit of a potion look to it, you could easily use that Cloud9 Interference pad on the insert there and create that look. While I'm waiting for the acetate on the front piece of my die cuts to dry, I'm going to layer up 6 different die cuts of this martini glass. I have them die cut out of black cardstock. I want to build up the ridge for my shaker card. Now I glued the rest of them together off screen and have them drying off to the side while I'm working on my background. I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here on my ultra sticky mat, and I'm using that same Regal gray interference pad to do the ink blending on the outside of this piece. I'm not trying to do any perfect or beautifully blended ink here. What I'm trying to do is get a gray outside, and the ink is going to build up on the edge of that cardstock. So when you tilt it in the light, it has that little bit of purple shimmer. I'm also doing that same Regal gray on the little bat die cut. This is going to go on the stir or the swizzle stick to go into my martini glass. And then lastly, I have some orange die cuts here. These are the little drips that go on the edge of the glass. I die cut them in orange because I'm trying to create a kind of a candy cane look. And I did ink blending on those with the Golden Sun interference ink pad. So that one shows up more pinky orange and then has a little bit of a gold shimmer. And I'm using that same ink pad to ink around some black cardstock for my mat, as well as the top piece for my drink. So now that those pieces are inked and the ink has dried, I can start gluing them onto my card base. So my black mat here is cut to 5 3/8 inches by 4 1/8 inch. And my white piece here is cut to 5 1/4 inches by 4 inches. So the mats on these cards are a lot smaller than on my first 2 cards. I wanted to make sure that I had as much space as possible for my martini glass. And after I glued all my layers together, I cut out the top little rim on the inside just to leave a little bit more room for my drink bits or my shaker bits to shake around. Now that my glass is on my base, I can put the pieces or the layers for that drink. And I did them just out of cardstock scraps that I have in my scrap bin in a really pale yellow, kind of a light orange color, and then a darker orange color. And that darker orange color is the one that I also inked with that Golden Sun interference pad just to give it a little bit of extra shimmer. Before pressing the top of that bottle down, I put the swizzle stick base in there just to make sure that I could get it behind the rim of the glass. I didn't want to put it in front of the rim because of the dimension from layering those dies up for the shaker piece. I wanted it to go in the back. Now that I have my glass down, I can put my pieces in there for my shaker. And I have some shaker bits. These are called Spellbound. They're on the Spellbinders website. This is a perfect mix for Halloween. And I'm just picking out bits that are going to go with the color scheme of the card. So there's some bat confetti in this mix. There are stars that are orange and yellow. And then I also have a few little purple pieces that are going to go and coordinate really well with the purple interference ink that I have on different things. And then this mix also has some gemstones to it that have a black base and a greeny purpley, just a shine to it that's going to work well with this card. So I am putting those gemstones there, but I am also taking my die pick and making sure that they get flipped over so the colored part of those gemstones are showing. For some reason, every single one that I put in there wanted to show just the black flat side. So you do need to make sure to flip them over because there's not going to be enough room for them to be flipping over once the shaker is put together. If you want them facing a certain way, you want to do that before you assemble the top. Once I have all my shaker bits in there, or as many as I want to be in there, I'm going to glue on the top of the front of that shaker window, and then all of that is going to be enclosed. Before I do that, I want to make sure to trim off the excess of that acetate. And this is a really easy shape to do that with. So I can do that with my Spellbinders scissors. It cuts it beautifully and it gets a perfect rim on the edge of that glass. And then I can use that same Barely Art glue to glue this top to the base of my shaker window. So this is a fun way just to add a little bit of an interactive element to that martini glass. I kept the background very, very simple so that it wasn't going to take away from the shaker element as well as that martini glass. And then I went with this front to the glass on, I can glue down those little drippy bits. Now this die set that cuts these drippy bits, there's 3 different pieces to it. I only did the 2 ones on the outside of the rim. I didn't want to cover up too much of those shaker pieces inside. You could add that 3rd one if you wanted. But once again, I didn't want to cover too much of that up. So with that window, or with that shaker glass done, I can add the little sentiment, and I just propped it up the side of the stem of the martini glass. You could put it regular way so it's horizontal as well. I just thought that was a little bit more, or a little bit different, a little bit more interesting. So with my autumn card done, I can start working on my winter one. So I'm using the All Seasons Winter press plate and die set for this card, but I will do those sentiments later. Right now I'm working on some of the elements for the card. So for my background, I did the Sparkling Snow embossing folder, and I embossed some hammermill cardstock, and then I cut that down and used my Regal gray interference pad just to lightly ink those snowflakes. So it's going to give those snowflakes a gray look, but where the ink is the heaviest, you're going to see a little bit of a purple tint, and it's going to coordinate beautifully with the purple and silver color scheme that I have for the different pieces for this card. So I'm using the Delivering Joy sleigh die set. This is from, I think it's the Handmade Holidays collection. This is a beautiful sleigh, and it comes with a bunch of different gifts that you can pile up in that sleigh. And I have them die cut out of purple cardstock. This is a Lilac Blossom cardstock from Spellbinders, as well as Fog cardstock, which is a really, really light gray. And then the bows and ties on the gifts, I have die cut out of several different finishes from that Silver Treasured cardstock pack. I wanted to add the silver, and I love the fact that I have a few different finishes that I can choose from. I did do one silver bow and then one purple bow for on top of those presents. Didn't think it needed much more than that. For my sleigh itself, I've cut that out of the Fog cardstock and then used some matte silver for my sleigh rails, as well as the skis or whatever is at the bottom of sleighs. And then I also use that same Lilac Blossom as a solid piece to go behind the more intricate cut piece for the front, so that you see a little peek of those purple tones. With this die set, the ribbon cross pieces, there's just one die for that. You can glue it onto the front of each of the gifts. It fits all of them, and then just cut off the excess. So it's really smart way to create a die that works with all of those gifts, and then just cut off the excess to have them fit each one. So I'm still using that same Barely Art glue for all of this assembly with that fine tip bottle, and you can see how easily it works for smaller pieces as well as larger pieces. And once again, just like the other cards, anytime I've layered something together to glue, I also put my acrylic block on there to hold it nice and flat, make sure that everything glues down nicely, and it just frees up my hands to be working on other stuff. Now I'm going to put these gifts in the sleigh when I assemble my card, but you could also leave them out if you want. And this die set also has a poinsettia and some greenery if you wanted to just have the sleigh and then just have that floral and the greenery on that. That would look absolutely gorgeous as well. Or you could have just the sleigh on its own, or have it all together, have the presents piled up in the sleigh, have the florals and greenery as well. So there's really a lot of options with this die set. So with that, pretty much all of my pieces ready to go, I can start assembling my card. So I glued down my mat, and before I glued down my snowflake piece, I just cut a little piece of white cardstock for the bottom to give the illusion of snow. I wanted to make sure that that sleigh has somewhere to sit on rather than hovering in the air. So I just cut a sliver of it. It doesn't need to be absolutely perfect. In fact, I personally like it when it's not absolutely perfect and it has a little bit of bumps. I think it looks a little bit more realistic. And then glued that to the bottom, trimmed it down to size, and then glued it to the card. Now for this one, I cut my purple mat, which is the Lilac Blossom cardstock, at 5 3/8 inches by 4 1/8 inches, and then my snowflake embossed piece is cut down to 4 inches by 5 1/4. So once again, smaller mats on this. So you can pick and choose whether you want a larger mat to see a little bit more of that, or a smaller one, and I love the fact that there is that choice. With all of my gifts made, I can start to pile them up on the sleigh here. And what I'm trying to do is not have two purple ones beside each other and not have two fog ones beside each other. So I'm trying to alternate it a little bit. However, once I am finished, I do notice that I have two different ones that have silver glitter cardstock, which would not be my first choice, but it's probably something that no one else noticed until I said it. And I haven't even glued that second one down, so you probably don't even notice it yet, but now you'll see it. I'm also gluing down the little bow pieces. Now, when I assembled them ahead of time, I glued the bows together, but I didn't glue the little trailing ribbon to it because I wanted to be able to customize that when I assembled it onto my sleigh. I wanted to make sure that I didn't have them facing the exact same way and have them a little bit different. The other thing I'm doing here is some of these gifts are a little bit too big, so I'm just taking my scissors and shortening them. Just because a die cut is a certain size doesn't mean you have to keep it that size, so you can absolutely customize it and shorten it and make it to your liking. Once I have all my gifts on here, I'm ready to start creating and assembling my sentiment. So I stick all of that aside to dry. And I have a piece of hammer mill cardstock here. I'm going to be using the All Seasons Winter Press Plate and Die Set. And I'm going to do the same thing as I did on my first card, except that I'm going to emboss it with silver embossing powder. So I'm inking my press plate with Versamark ink. I have my embossing powder tool that I've put on my paper. Going to put the clear plate onto my base and then run it through my Platinum 6 machine and then emboss it with superfine silver embossing powder. So this is going to create that silver sentiment that's going to work perfectly with the silver in my card here. You could also use purple ink and do it that way and have a purple sentiment, but I thought the silver would be absolutely beautiful. So with that powder on there, I can use my embossing tool and heat emboss each one of these sentiments. And once again, I'm creating 6 different sentiments at once, but I'm only going to be using one for this card. So I have some extras to use for a future project. And I love plates like this that are so easy to use that you can create multiple sentiments at once and have extras to use for future projects. Just before I was about to place my die down, I realized that there were a couple areas that weren't fully melted. So you definitely want to make sure that you've got all of your embossing powder melted before you put your plate on or you put your die on there to cut. So I'd cut that off screen and I'm just going to use this Christmas time sentiment. And I'm actually going to break up that area where I was talking about before, where I have 2 gifts that have the silver glitter cardstock. This is going to cut that up a little bit, break it up a little bit, make it a little bit less noticeable, or at least to me. Once that was glued down, I just put my acrylic block on there and let that sit for a few moments. Now the last card I want to do is I want to use that All Seasons stamp set. Before I use any new stamp set, the first thing I do is take a white eraser and I erase the stamping surface of my stamp set. This removes any manufacturing residue that can possibly interfere with it taking ink. And I know if I have done it to one stamp, I've done it to my entire set. So I do the entire set the first time I open it up to use it, so that I know anytime I go to use that set, it's been done. For this one, I wanted to create a very simple image for my card. So I'm using the Uncharted Waters layer stencil. This is from the Fair Winds collection that came out a couple months ago. And I absolutely love this layer stencil. It makes it so easy to create a beautiful scene. And there's other dies in here that are coastal theme that create such beautiful cards. I've done several videos of them. So if you want to see them, go look back in my channel and you'll see a few different ways that you can use this stencil. For this video, I'm using some Opal Blush Interference ink. This is going to show up the blue color that you're seeing for the water, but when you tilt it in the light, you're going to see a bit of a pink interference. So it creates a beautiful shimmer on the top of that water. And I'm being fairly heavy around the outside edges of this image and trying to be a little bit lighter towards the center because I don't want it to be one solid color. I want it to have a little bit of variation to it. Now with that layer done, I can put my next stencil down, and these interference inks wash off the stencils beautifully just with water. You don't need any special cleaner or anything. For this layer here, I'm doing the rocks and the clouds, and I'm just using some Hickory Smoke Distress ink, and I'm just going to do the full area of the rocks, but just the underside of the clouds. And even with the rocks, I'm trying to be heavier towards the bottom of the rock and a little bit lighter towards the top. And I've used this stencil before, so I know there's other layers to go on that rock. So I don't need to completely cover it. I want to leave some area that you can add a little bit more depth and dimension with the next layers. For my sky, I'm just using some tumbled glass distress ink. And for this one, I'm using a large Spellbinders ink blending brush. It is great for larger areas, and you can create a lot softer looks with it. So I love that for this sky. It just worked beautifully to create a little bit more of a softer sky. For the bushes on, or the shrubs on the other side of the water, I'm just using some bundled sage. It's a really nice light green. You can make it darker if you wanted, but I wanted it to be nice and light and subtle. I didn't want anything harsh on here. So once that is done, I can do one of the layers of the facets from the rock boulder here. I'm going to do that the same hickory smoke that I did for the first layer, just doing a little bit darker layer for this. This next stencil has another area of those shrubs and then another facet area for the rocks. Once again, I can do that hickory smoke on there and then the bundled sage for the greenery. So once again, with that rock there, I tried to make sure that each of the layers had a little bit different layer of that hickory smoke. It's all the same color, but some areas are heavier than others. The last stencil here, I'm using the Regal gray color for the silhouettes of the seagulls in the sky. And then I'm going to use Sapphire Gold for that water reflection, or the darker areas of the water. And that one has a darker blue color, but the interference color for this is gold. So when you tilt it to the light on that water, you're going to get the pink shimmer from the lighter areas, and then you're going to get the gold shimmer from the darker color from the Sapphire Gold. So it creates a beautiful combination. So you can see we created just a really simple but beautiful background, and our sentiment is going to be the perfect complement to it. So with this background done, I can take it off of the sticky mat and kind of trim it down. And I trimmed this one down to 4 inches by 5 1/4 inches. I have a white piece of hammer mill cardstock here that I'm trimming down to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8. And I'm going to use the Regal Gray interference pad just to go along the edges of that for a mat. So we're going to have that gray color that's going to coordinate beautifully, but when you tilt it in the light, it's going to have a little bit of that purple interference, and that's going to complement the other interference colors that are in the background perfectly. So for my sentiment, I'm using my Misty stamping tool to make sure that I get perfect placement, and that way, if I need to stamp it a second time, I can easily do that. So I'm placing it in or where I want it on my card, and then when I'm closing my door, I'm making sure that that sentiment lines up with the lines on the door to make sure that it's nice and straight. I'm doing some simple stamping here with some black memento pad. It would also be gorgeous if you embossed it on this background as well, but I kept it very, very simple. And now we can start assembling our card. So once again, assembling it with the Barely Art glue, gluing down the mat first, and then I'm gluing down my image piece, and I'm going to put that acrylic block on there in between to make sure that everything stays nice and flat. Now I didn't add any extra mediums on this background here because I'm using the interference pads and they already have some shimmer to it. I didn't think it was necessary, but you could if you wanted to, or you could enhance it by embossing that sentiment like I mentioned before. So here is our very simple but beautiful summer card with that stamped image or that stamped sentiment. Then we have our all seasons winter, our all seasons autumn, and then our all seasons summer. So you can see with this collection, you can create some seasonal cards all throughout the year, but the variety is really endless. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.